We talk about banks that lead in sustainable finance and how they can enhance their reputation, build trust with customers, investors, and the public. And this can, of course, lead to increased customer loyalty and new business opportunities. But what else? Now, we'll hear from Warrick from S&P Global Sustainable, who will come up on stage and talk us through this.
Good afternoon. I have the pleasure of presenting a short, and I promise a short, case study just before we go to lunch, and hopefully provide some food for thought. So this brief case study and this analysis is essentially looking at financial institutions and their sustainable practices, their sustainability disclosures in terms of the global market. And firstly, to understand where a lot of this data is coming from, it's coming from our corporate sustainability assessment that we've essentially been running for the last 25 years. And what the assessment aims to do on a yearly basis is capture approximately 1,000 different metrics per company within the 14,000 universe of companies. So it collects all of these financial metrics. And again, what's important today is that a lot of the metrics that it collects are industry specific. So under themes that would be relevant and material to financial institutions. And although in small writing you can see on the left, here are some of the themes that we look at in this assessment: sustainable finance, financial inclusion, policy influence, climate strategy, looking at metrics like disclosures of targets, looking at metrics like carbon price shadowing, a lot of granular detail into a lot of the different areas of positive sustainable finance. So, to quickly start, quite a simple analysis. It's based on disclosures. We looked at all the financial institutions within the universe of roughly 14,000 companies. 1,700 of these are financial institutions, 800 banks, 700 financial services institutions, and insurers. And what we're simply looking at here is the number of institutions that have publicly disclosed on their net zero or intermediate targets. And I think quite across the board, you can see if you aggregate all this data, approximately 20% of these institutions out of that large number have public disclosures on net zero targets and on intermediate targets. But notably as well, this is specific to financed emissions, so not their overall corporate target, but specifically to that Scope 3 financed emissions. We see that banks are performing roughly in the middle, insurers are performing a lot better in terms of these disclosures, and probably because they're more directly impacted by climate change in the direct assets they insure against physical risks. However, it's not all doom and gloom. This analysis also includes a year-on-year analysis, and we can see that for every sector that the number of targets that have been disclosed for the total universe is increasing. So for banks, roughly 5% increases, for insurers 4%, however somewhat stagnant for the financial services institutions. So we wanted to expand this analysis a bit. And look at the universe of companies that are signatories for the principles of responsible banking. So we looked at all the signatories that are public online, and we wanted to say how many of these institutions are also covered by our corporate sustainability assessment, and look at their disclosure numbers compared to the total universe. And this is broken down in region, as you can see, with roughly, if we look at Europe performing the best over on the left, we see that Europe's performing the best. For PRB signatories, we see 70% of them have made these disclosures on emission reduction targets or net zero commitments for financed emissions. So across the board, you can begin to notice that the PRB signatories are consistently outperforming the total CSA universe in terms of these public disclosures. Right on the right, you see the US and Canada in terms of the corporate sustainability universe showing the lowest numbers of disclosures. However, for the 5 signatories that are both in the PRB universe and the CSA universe, all of them have made these commitments. So we're going to move a bit on now from targets, and we're going to start looking at some of the metrics in the CSA that help determine strategy and what actions financial institutions are taking. And quite simply, from a policy perspective for fossil fuels, we see a large number, almost two-thirds of the financial institutions in the CSA have policies against financing coal. Quite a bit less than that, at about 40%, are committed to not furthering or investing in new coal activities. Oil and gas shows slightly lower policy commitments at 50 and 30% for financing and investing activities. So again, to go a bit further to look at the actual practices, we also wanted to determine how many of these financial institutions actively report on the sustainable products and services that they offer. So when we're capturing data and looking at all of these reports for these 1,000 different banks and financial institutions, we make sure and validate that they are actually offering sustainable financial services and products. And again, we see, compared to the targets, a lot more institutions are reporting that they have these offerings. Roughly 40% of the total universe has one or the other. Sustainable investing is ubiquitously higher than the financing side. And roughly we see the same regional distribution, with Europe leading the way in terms of publicly reporting that they offer these products. Again, so somewhat complex disclosure analysis here, and this is all within an article that we actually released today. So come find me for the link if you're interested. We decided to hone in on sustainable corporate finance, and we wanted to understand how many companies publicly report on their sustainability-linked offerings, their loans. And we see that out of the universe of 1,000 companies, banks and financial institutions, only roughly 300 and, I can't see the exact number there, 341 disclose that they have sustainable corporate finance offerings. And in terms of the actual monetary values, only 17% of that total universe actually puts numbers to this within their reports. So what is the value of all of their corporate financing linked to sustainability-linked bonds or green, social, or sustainable loans? And you can see the distribution there, 72 reporting on the monetary values of sustainability-linked loans, 155 reporting on green, social, or sustainable loans. And the definitions are there at the bottom for your later perusal. 54 in total report both of these categories in terms of loans. So finally, to conclude this case study, we wanted to further understand what are the actual percentages of their total corporate finance book that are linked to these sustainability-linked loans. So out of the total value, the total book of business for corporate finance in banks, 13% of that value is from sustainable-linked loans, whereas for the financial services industry, 15%, so roughly higher. So we can see that it's still a relatively small proportion of the total value that is actually linked to sustainable loans. So I think the sentiment and takeaway here is that across the board, we see that disclosure is very important. We can't measure what is not disclosed. And it's true, many of these institutions could be undertaking all of these practices and making these commitments internally. However, it's not always translating to actual reported figures in order for us to benchmark. So I think it's going to be a very interesting year next year when we started looking at all the sustainability reports for the 2024 financial year to see how these numbers will have changed in light of regulations requiring this reporting, especially in terms of that regional analysis to see which regions are really pushing for this granular detail of reporting. So with that, I hope you have a good lunch, and thank you.